So this video is, I guess, a new chapter in what I want to remind people is not the focus of my channel and my work, but something that does come up because it's inevitable. It's part of my background. It's part of the news cycle, and that is what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is leading to and its effect on the public sphere, the issues of freedom of speech, and how people are allowed to express themselves in what is supposed to be a free society. So if you are subscribed to the newsletter, and I'll include the link below to the newsletter sign up as well as to this new edition of it. I'm calling this, though, there is no way to be pro or anti-Israel or Palestine enough for anyone. And the reason I'm calling it this is because if you have been following the news about this conflict, there's a lot of media figures, there's a lot of different advocacy groups, and even there were games journalists who were trying to dickwag about how much they support, in many cases, the Palestinians, or if you're talking about Fox News, how much they support Israel. I was hearing people like Dave Rubin and Clay Travis talking about how basically Israel is this country where there's no one else to help them. They're basically being persecuted and surrounded on all sides and besieged by these threats and everything. And while I would agree on the basis of facts, there's no reason to disagree with them from my perspective. I'm starting to see this milestone being passed where I don't think that people speaking up about this topic necessarily is going to lead anywhere, right? Maybe it never was going to help. Unfortunately, if you live in the United States, your effect as an individual on what's happening with U.S. foreign policy and what we're doing overseas isn't really that much, whether you're a supporter of Israel or Palestine. So this newsletter entry is a little bit of a reflection on that, and why I think that if you get too emotional, too inflamed over what's going on in the Middle East, you have to step back and remember you live in the United States. Most of the people that will either read this newsletter or watch this video will either be living in the U.S. or somewhere else in the West, not living in either Israel or Gaza. And yet most people who will read it have a very opinionated attitude towards the conflict because they have a personal stake. I have a personal stake in it. I don't want to hide it, but I also want to make clear that because I have a personal stake in it, when people read my opinions or watch my videos, they're perfectly right to point out that, yeah, I have a bias. I can't be called a neutral observer, and therefore it doesn't really help to go and browbeat other people, force people to say, I support this side, I support that side, moralize about it, because you have to realize there's competing interests. There are perspectives that sort of cut against the grain, right? We'll talk a little bit about both of them. And getting started, so to explain my bias, so I'm not only am I an American Jew, both of my parents were born in Israel, so therefore I lived there after high school, served in the Israeli army as I was legally obligated to. The vast majority of my service, apart from training, was in the West Bank, which is a territory that was occupied by the Israelis after the Six-Day War. And much of the territory in the West Bank is well, first of all, the majority of the population of it is Arab Palestinian. But there are various settlements that have been built there that are populated by Jewish, you would call them Jewish settlers or Jewish, the opponents of Israel would call them even colonizers and things like that. But the reality is many of those communities, they're very successful agricultural combines, or they have a very important role in the export of vegetables, and specifically vegetables, and I think in some cases textile products to Europe, and also wines and things like that. And while I'm not saying that people don't have a right to be angry about it, in large part it's not as if the settlements themselves infringe on anyone's human rights, because many of these Palestinian villages and other hamlets, they don't necessarily have specific boundaries. They have existed since prior to there being a real a regime where land rights were as concrete. Now that doesn't mean that there were never landowners from among the Palestinian Arabs, but I'm just saying that it's not entirely accurate to say that these people have stolen land from anyone specifically. So I would say this: I don't have any problem with Arab Palestinians staying on their land and farming, or producing, opening a factory or whatever. And at the same time, I don't have any problem with Jewish Israelis doing the same thing, even in the West Bank. People are also unaware that within Israel itself, not just the West Bank, there are many Arab Palestinians who are very successful economically. They have their own, so to speak, parallel economy. Remember, there's always parallel economies in even free societies, because there are people who prefer to buy and sell and rent and retain lawyers within their own community. That's just the way it is. People are sectarian, even if you don't want to admit it. So there are many of these pundits, like Cenk Uygur, like Mark Lamont Hill, like Roger Waters, that falsely label Israel an apartheid state, when just, I think the other day, a new government was formed in Israel, and one of the central partners, in fact, the partner that was needed in order to create the government, was the United Arab List, a party that is not only Arab in its composition, it's Arab in its identity, it's even Islamist in its identity, which is causing a lot of worry, understandably so, among many Israelis. So this whole notion that there's no rights and no capabilities for Israel's Palestinian Arab population, the citizens that have Israeli citizenship, it's just factually untrue. I would say that some of them suffer from professional or social discrimination, but in the legal sense they don't. And from a personal perspective, I can't sit here and pretend to be objective about this topic, knowing what I know, seeing what I've seen, having seen what I've seen, and been a soldier and seen really that, yes, the Palestinian militant factions, they do practice, not only do they practice terrorism in the literal sense, in that they often, they perpetrate their operations not only with a military aim, but an aim to cause fear among a civilian population by dropping rockets in civilian areas, by often infiltrating Israeli settlements and murdering civilians, murdering, for example, the 15-year-old child Hillel Yaffe a few years back. This girl that was no threat to them, murdered in cold blood by infiltrators. So I do believe that they don't have a legitimate case, because they you see them by their fruits, as some would say. I think that's more of like a New Testament phrase. You should know them by their fruits. But nevertheless, I think it's an apt phrase if you want to characterize what's going on. And the other reason is that, having served myself, having also, when you see one of your own relatives who's only, I had, for example, a cousin who was only, I think, 9 years old when I moved back to the U.S. And, I certainly, in my mind, when I was serving in the military, I had this mindset that I serve for the defense of people like her, my cousin, blood of my blood. But then it took on a new meaning when I saw years later that she'd enlisted for service. As part of her service, she served in the police, not in the military. But you certainly have an identity with that, because you have a common, not only do you have common blood, now you've had a common experience with someone. Not the same experience, but still a common experience. So this article really is about how in the space of the commentary about Israel and Palestine, you can never be enough to you can never advocate enough to satisfy everyone. Now obviously there are people who are considered superstars on each side. There is, for example, Ben Shapiro, who I don't like personally, but he's considered a superstar on the pro-Israel side. You have Ali Abu Nima, or Roger Waters, considered to be titans of the pro-Palestinian side. But the truth is that you can always find people who will be dissatisfied with these spokespeople, because they always want something that's much more hardcore. They want somebody that will say, for example, that Israel must be, quote unquote, wiped off the map. There's also people who will say that Palestine is not a nation, never has been. It's foolish even to speak of a Palestine, or things like that. And I want to say this. What I'm talking about here is that this desire to create a pure viewpoint on the issue, a viewpoint that is an absolute viewpoint, that either Israel must exist along the entire territory of historical Israel from the Bible, or vice versa, that Palestine must be from the river to the sea. It creates this this idiotic gravitational pull where you suck in people who really nobody needs to care what they think. Like Mayim Bialik, the star of Blossom and Big Bang Theory, who talks. I wouldn't say that she is she's a bonehead, but who cares what Mayim Bialik thinks? Now, I think she's correct. She criticized recently actual physical assaults in Los Angeles by pro-Palestine activists against Jewish diners. I do think Bill Maher has it right when he ripped Bella Hadid and Bella and whatever the other Hadid girl's name is, Gigi and Bella, who cares, he fought with Nicholas Kristof on his show, and basically he said that there is no moral equivalence. The Gaza and Palestinian society are sort of anchored in a backward medieval mindset. They don't see women as full partners in society. They don't see the West as a good partner with the Muslim world. So why would an American who believes in freedom, or in at least freedom of speech, why would they support the Palestinians as his stance? Now you can come up with some reasons where you think, well, we shouldn't be involved there. We shouldn't be spreading American democracy by the barrel of a gun, or the gunboat diplomacy as we used to do in East Asia back in the 19th century. The U.S. used to spread U.S. liberty for using gunboats to China and Japan. That if you don't know about that. But I think he certainly is correct that if you're a person who is living in Hollywood, is somebody who is, living a blatantly Western libertine lifestyle like the Hadid girls, yeah, it does clash with supporting an Islamist religious fanatic state. So I agree with Bill Maher on that. The other thing that I think we have to take into account, I don't think like Bill Maher is bringing up Palestine and Israel every week, but the media seems very obsessed with it. But the reality is that most Americans don't really see Israel and Palestine to be that big of an issue. There's very little fluctuation, at least according to this tracking poll by Gallup. I have seen other ones where you see among the American left support for Israel sinking, and other than that, it's largely remained the same in terms of support. Most Americans, for whatever reason, they have maintained a steady level of support of Israel. In fact, it's risen since 2013. But it is sinking among Democrats. The Palestinians are definitely gaining amongst Democrats. They're not doing too bad among independents. And people have to be aware that yeah, the American public opinion can change, but they're not going to change because you simply drive it into their head that oh, you're wrong, you support apartheid, or you support Islamic terror or whatever. If you don't give a full-throated expression of support for either side. Something that I've seen is kind of funny is that Cenk Uygur was destroyed by his own side for giving a take that I think, I mean, it's just an honest take on his part. I don't know if you can ever say about anything else that he says as being honest, but I think this does say a little bit about what he really believes. He says Israelis and Palestinians kill each other over which sky god they pretend to speak to, and it's politically incorrect to point out that there is no human god, let alone one that favors Jews or Muslims. All this violence over the equivalent of which character they like better in the MCU. Now, people literally started to blast him in that, or not literally, but they did blast him in the face over this. Huwaida Araf said, wow, delete, apologize, then talk to Palestinians and anti-apartheid Jewish or Israeli activists. I can also recommend some good books. For decades, Palestinians have been saying this is not religious conflict, yet you ignore and amplify framing of religious zealots. Well, Huwaida Arif, I'm sorry to say, is wrong. And believe it or not, Cenk Uygur is sort of right. It doesn't really matter if Jewish or Israeli activists for Palestinians are not Islamists. The real leadership of the Palestinian Authority, in Gaza at least, is Islamist. Hamas is the group that rules Gaza. Their acronym stands for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which means the Islamic Resistance Movement. It's not the Palestinian Resistance Movement. Hamas's name is an acronym in Arabic for the Islamic Resistance Movement. So while there are secular Palestinian advocates or secular Palestinians, there's ones who are Muslim, but they are nationalist. The real leadership, the real drive in Palestinian government has nothing to do with secularism. It has everything to do with Islam. In fact, secular Palestinian activism, while it's succeeded in getting a foothold in the West, is basically evaporating in Palestinian society because there's been a religious awakening. That's something that people on the left can't accept. That yes, in Muslim societies, not just in Palestine, by the way, in other societies like Pakistan and even in Muslim areas of India, there has been a lot of religious awakening, and the notion that you can attract these people to class politics, to politics of Marxism by harping on their oppression is it's very it's very ignorant. It ignores really the reality of traditional societies where people have family bonds, they have even clan bonds of larger families, extended families, things like that. It's delusional and it's dangerous. But yeah, people blasted him. Aaron, this is funny though. Aaron Mate says, "My God tells me that this is the worst tweet of all time." Aaron Mate, I think, is one of these pro-Palestine journalists who I don't agree with any of his political beliefs, but I don't think that he's really doing it from a place of dishonesty. I think he simply is a supporter of this political stance where, I'm an anti-imperialist. I always oppose this country, whether it's the U.S. or it's Israel or Britain or whatever. But sometimes he discovers things that are, unjust. And then other times I think he is basically being, a naked partisan. This is an example of why people who are too much invested in the conflict are incapable of divorcing their personal views from what's actually going on, right? So they can ignore the fact that while Israel did cause more casualties among the Palestinians than the other way around, the Palestinians are nakedly indoctrinating their children to be martyrs. They raise their children to cherish the opportunity to be a martyr. There are here. You can actually watch some of their videos. So here's just one video.
Hey there, welcome to Comedy Bang Bang. We have a great show tonight. David Ruffles is here, as well as memory expert Arthur Steinberg. Scott Augerman. And I have to rate tonight's show on a scale of 1 to 10.
So here you
Hillary
have
Clinton at a press conference with
you had a mother that was laying out a bomb-laden vest. Okay, what's about?
Palestinian Media Watch in the U.S. Senate criticized Palestinian television and school books.
We must stop the propaganda to which Palestinian children are being exposed because it basically profoundly poisons the minds of these children.
Hamas uses its television station to indoctrinate Palestinian children to value violence, hatred, and martyrdom.
So think about that for a second. So this is actual Palestinian TV with real children and real weapons. And the people who call themselves progressives in the United States, who don't believe Americans have the right to keep and bear arms, are seeing this as the just side of the Middle East conflict. And I think if you don't see a problem with that, you're sort of too invested in an ideology. You're too invested in ideology. Forget the whole narrative of oppressed versus oppressor for a second. If you have the power to produce propaganda urging children to take up arms in order to liberate a homeland, then sorry, I just saw a spelling error. Then you might have a little bit of an issue that's beyond bias, right? So I just want to make you aware of that. But at the same time, there was also a smaller group, a pro-Israel group, that was trying to make the point that Candace Owens, because she hadn't really spoken up about the Israel-Palestine conflict recently that this was anti-Semitic, that she didn't see it as important enough because she didn't care for the lives of Jews that are threatened by Palestinians. And this brings up a separate issue that I think is just as important. When people tell you that you have a duty to speak up about an issue that you don't necessarily think is your strong point, because this is apparently what she had said, you should ignore them. You should basically tell them that they shouldn't tell you what to say, that compelled speech is the opposite of freed speech. Okay, there's two types of abridgment of freedom of speech. There's the speech that you want to say that they don't let you say, and then there's speech that you don't want to say that they make you say, which is compelled speech. And neither of them are in keeping with the spirit of the First Amendment that we ought to be upholding. Okay, so I would say, yeah, I would certainly not oppose Candace Owens speaking of her own initiative in regards to her thoughts on the conflict, whatever they may be, whether on one side or the other. But we shouldn't force people to take stances just because we support them. And we're going to get a little bit later to the issue of actual violence in the advocacy, because that's an issue that I think is more one-sided. There's only one side that I think in the advocacy for their side are committing violence against the advocates of the other side. But before we get to that, this pro-Israel movement that people are telling you to be a part of, if you're in the American Jewish community, it is, I believe, a failed movement. Part of the reason that it fails is because it tries to get state and federal government agencies to issue bans or pass legislation that excludes the BDS movement from business with government bodies. Not just the BDS movement, but people who are supporters of it. And people have to, in some cases, sign a pledge that they're not taking part in the BDS movement. And people have tried to split hairs and say, well, it doesn't mean that they can't have an opinion. It doesn't mean that. No, the fact is that there have already been several court rulings, I believe, in Kansas, Georgia, Arkansas. Most of these laws are in states that are deep red, deep conservative states where there's very, very strong support for Israel. And they always seem to lose in federal court because in a simple reading of the First Amendment says that even an idea that is blatantly wrong, right? Having like an idea that is in its simple, surface reading, like flat Earth theory, you still have a right to advocate for it. You have the right to be wrong in America. You have the right to say things that are both incorrect and harmful, by the way. Hurtful, I would say, to other people's feelings, because we came from a society in Britain where there was a lot of sectarianism. There were many different sects that were emerging out of the Reformation. And they clashed a lot. And unfortunately, in Britain, they established an official church. There was a lot of religious discrimination for many years, and it didn't resolve the religious conflicts. In many cases, it just sort of concentrated them in certain parts of the UK. In America, we went a different way. We said, no, we're going to have people make up their own mind. We'll have a robust public differences, public discussion about many of these things, whether it was religion as it originally was, or whether it was all manner of other topics. That's the First Amendment I want to support. I don't want to support a First Amendment that's limited only to the topics that make me comfortable, because that isn't a First Amendment. That isn't a free speech amendment at all, right? So if people want to advocate for BDS and they want to come to my door, I'm not going to report them or try to, get, if they're doing business with the government, get their contract canceled simply because, I disagree with you, therefore you shouldn't be able to do business. No, I'm going to talk to them if I'm interested and have a discussion. And if they're not willing to have the discussion, I think really it shows their shallowness. But if I'm trying to shut down the discussion to begin with, it shows that I'm the weaker person, right? And that's what I think that this legislation is. I think the BDS movement, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, if you don't know, they're weak people because they say, we should not have any people performing in Israel because that validates apartheid. Because if some group of Israelis wants to go and watch the Midnight Oil reunion tour or whatever, the Temptations fifth lineup reunion tour in Israel, or what have you, that somehow is a war crime. It's ridiculous. The BDS movement is, in and of itself, it's a failure. It hasn't really succeeded in any way in diminishing the success of Israel in an economic sense. The country goes from strength to strength usually, barring, of course, exceptional periods like the pandemic and things like that. But I do want to get to something that I still think is worthy of talking about. There were these attacks. There was the attack in LA. I think I mentioned it in a previous video, okay? And you can find that video on BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey if you want. But there were Jewish diners that were attacked in LA, and they weren't even there counter-protesting the Palestinians. They were dining out, and this caravan of Palestinians drove by and called out who are the Jews over here, and they basically assaulted a bunch of them. There are other examples here that are, it's pretty, it's ridiculous how people think that this is, what advocacy really is. This was in Australia. Massive pro-Palestinian protests in Melbourne and Sydney today. Protesters held signs stating "Get Israel out of Palestine." Now, okay, so those statements are hurtful, but are they really something that people should see as, threatening them or, a real something that threatens them directly rather than just threatens their sensibilities? This is what happened in London. Okay, so if you think that what happened in Australia is not flagrant enough, that's fine. What about what happened in London? This is what was heard on Finchley Road in London. It was on May 16th. So if you're not hearing what they're saying, he says, fuck the Jews, fuck their daughters and mothers. Viral video from London shows pro-Palestine protesters advocating the rape of Jewish women. And I'm saying that even at the risk of YouTube flagging the video for me repeating what they said, to emphasize that in the Palestinian activism space, this is considered acceptable activism. There hasn't really been any pushback that I know about where they say, look, we get it that Israel is an illegitimate state and there's apartheid and they're perpetrating war crimes, but it might not be a great idea to advocate for raping their women, which, that's kind of why they say that they're against the Palestinians, right? Because they fear the consequences of yielding to them would lead to atrocities against the Jews. In that sense, I want to say this before I leave. There are these groups like the Zionist movement that have, for a long time, they've tried to say, we need a very, humanistic, secular, progressive vision for Israel that will be acceptable to the West. There's a lot of groups like that. There is no group like that. And by the way, they're a failed movement, the Zionist movement. Progressivism and Zionism are now almost, they cannot be remended, right? The Zionist movement has been completely expelled from progressivism. In fact, they can't even be in the same space with them. They get kicked out all the time. But on the other side, on the Palestinian side, you have many people who are otherwise very progressive, very feminist, very much for the rights of women and sexual minorities, the LGBTQ community, and they're siding with a group where things like this are not exactly rare. There are many of these people who are pro-Palestine activists who they see it as their violence that they, I'm not talking about, violent speech, which people talk about all the time, which is not really what's true, but violent speech as in direct threats, and also violent action as indicated by what happened in Los Angeles and what often happens when pro-Israel speakers go to campuses. They don't see that really as a problem because they see the ends justifying the means. They don't think the First Amendment is enough, so they don't really believe in it. They think that if you say something that is offensive to their sensibilities, then they have the right to shut down your event. They have the right to force your employer to fire you because it's too much trouble to keep you because they keep getting harassed. They're very much in favor of making the political personal and making the personal intolerable. So my final thing is this. You should not have compelled speech. You should not have repressed speech. And you should also not have speech where what you say ends up getting you assaulted simply for voicing what you think, right? We're supposed to live in a society where all views have their moment to be told, and people can choose to ignore them. People can choose to ridicule it. People can choose to parody it. But we shouldn't have one where it leads to this police state mentality. And unfortunately, I think on this topic, there's certainly people who are willing to let it sort of slide into that. So that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Remember to subscribe also to the newsletter below. Right? So this is the latest edition. It's also the title of this video. Also subscribe to me on Odyssey, BitChute, and Rumble rather than YouTube. You can follow me on Gavin Minds, where I typically post all of my videos in several groups. And you can also support me with either crypto or with real money, with fiat currency on Subscribestar. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk later.